Welcome back, everybody, for this week's episode of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. This week, we're looking at the creation of a ghost story, how to design a horror story, and how to manage multiple POVs while interweaving all of the many plots. I hope you enjoy. Today's author interview is with L.L. Madrid, a mild-mannered office worker from Tucson, Arizona. L.L. is a member of the Horror Writers Association and a past recipient of the Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley Scholarship. She is proud to be part of the Buy Book Gang, a Pitch War alum, and is also an Odyssey grad. Her short stories are scattered across the internet, and her 2025 debut novel, My Lips, Her Voice, is out on the 14th of October, 2025. Its back of book blurb reads, "A grandmother tormented by visions tried to warn the town, but nobody listened. Now, a haunted inheritance has passed to her granddaughters, Audrey and Mara. When Mara's body is discovered in the old mine, Audrey fears her grandmother's premonition is manifesting. The nightmare begins as Mara's spirit returns, lurking under Audrey's skin, hellbent on revenge and desperate to rekindle things with her former girlfriend Zadie. Willing to hijack Audrey's body to get what she wants, Mara drags them both into a deadly pursuit. When another girl in town goes missing, Audrey, Mara, and Zadie know the killer has struck again. In a fight to solve Mara's death and uncover the mystery of disappearances in Cooper City, the girls soon find themselves at war with each other. How do you survive long enough to hunt a murderer on the loose if that person inside you might just kill you first?" So just to start us off, what inspired you to write this story?
Well, this story was actually inspired by like a little weekend road trip. So I live in southern Arizona, and my partner and I went to Tombstone, which, if you're familiar with like the 90s movie, it's this Wild West town known for a shootout at the OK Corral with like Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp. And the town the main street has basically stayed the same since the 1800s, and it's become like this big tourist town. Like it's got the big dirt road, the carriages. And when we went there, they have people in their full period dress, and that's like their job. And I saw this like teenage girl like in the bustle and fully dressed up and very modern face and expressions. And it just got me thinking, like, that's an interesting character. That's either the worst after school job or the coolest, like, depending on your personality. And that just kind of planted a seed for what would later become Zadie. After we left Tombstone, there's a town like 20 minutes up the road that goes up to the mountains, and it's like an old mining town called Bisbee, and they have like the big uh, ravines and just the copper pit and the mines. And we stayed at a hotel there that's supposedly haunted. We didn't, they don't guarantee ghosts, but so it's called the Copper Queen, and it's all the 1800s. It's very fun Wild West. And all these little sights and images from the two different towns kind of, I'm like, it would be so much cooler if this was one town. And that's sort of like what started just planting these seeds of this story, is just looking around at these two different places and combining them.
So the setting is really what came first.
Which is usually it's a character for me, but this time it was just like this living, breathing place where I was kind of, I love one of my hobbies is going to different quirky towns, and we have a lot of them here. There's Jerome, which is known for being the wickedest town in the West, and just all these like they all have these little like Wild West lore. And I started just kind of compiling my favorite bits from all these different places, and that's where like I had a setting before I had anything else.
I mean, like, if you had to choose a setting, it's such a rich setting, and there's so much history involved, between the horrors of things that can go wrong in mines, versus the action adventure of, the cowboy and shootout westerns. I mean, you have like the range to play with.
Definitely. Like it's very, you get inspiration like in one of the towns they have a smelter, and when they were doing the big mining expeditions, people, it was like a robber baron situation too, and the people working these things, they were at high risk to die, and they didn't have insurance. And but so if you did die on the job, part of the perks was they would take care of your body for free, meaning they'd put it in the smelter and then mix it with cement. And now these now there's like these like little glistening parts in the sidewalks in Jerome, Arizona that are bones. And it's this wild history that you hear these things and you're like, well, I'm gonna steal that because it sounds like fiction and I'll put it in my book because why not?
Um,
But yeah, that was a little dark. Uh,
I have to say, it doesn't surprise me. Um, but that's also quite horrifying at the same time.
yeah.
I mean, like, I'm trying to imagine how you'd pitch that to the family. Oh yeah, yeah, we'll take care of the body, and then taking care of it, we've turned you into a sidewalk.
Yeah, you're part of history now and you'll be in the town forever. But I heard that on a I actually did a ghost tour, and that's what they told us about, and I was like, didn't believe it at first, and I went and I checked in on it, and I Googled it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is true. So it was, you know, but then I just started compiling all these little tidbits and lore, and it's like I like to collect weird things, and just little bit of historical bits became a thing.
The pieces of the sidewalk.
The pieces of the sidewalk. And when it's pointed out to you, it's really obvious. Like I would have never thought that, but it could point out the fragments.
Well, what's really interesting is there's a lot of ghost lore where the only way to completely get rid of a ghost is, for instance, to burn the body, to get like completely like, or lay the body to rest someplace, make sure it has proper rites, make sure it has this, make sure that, the body is well taken care of. And the reason why the spirit's around is that the body has not been well taken care of. And so now I'm just imagining how thorough were these last rites given to these people who died? Are these bodies, of people who I can very easily see where you could even just pull a ghost story of the sidewalk ghost bodies of like the people who are just being trodden on all day long.
Yeah, I didn't use that, but there's definitely that idea of just unrest and why people would linger and what would make, what would inspire your motivation to be a ghost.
Yeah, I mean, like, on the other hand, if you were, a really happy-go-lucky kind of person and you kind of enjoyed, the sights and sounds of the town, you'd be in town forever. You could hang out and see the whole town evolve. I mean, maybe it's the best place to be buried as a ghost.
Yeah, I mean, you could watch how things change and what doesn't, and then you could,
Imagine like getting buried or your body is being used for like the foundation of like what will eventually be a movie theater. You just like sit there and you got like prime time all the time.
that would be the good spot to be. So you get to see all the movies for free and see how it
Exactly. You wouldn't even know the movies were going to be there, but like all of a sudden it happened. I mean, it started out with shootouts and then you turned around and now you've got shootouts on the big screen.
you're like, hey, they're telling my life story. They got that wrong, but it's
Exactly. She's like, I was there.
you should have consulted me. But
I was just like, no,
uh,
that'll veer away from horror into more comedic aspects of ghosts.
horror comedy is very fun. My book, unfortunately, is not a comedy, but I think that's something I'd like to experiment with in the future because there, that B movie kind of quality is very fun.
You pitch it to your agent next time, see what they say.
Definitely.
For the ghosts in your particular story, we know from the beginning that one of the sisters dies, but then she inhabits her sister's body. There's a lot to unpack with that particular arrangement. Like, why did you want to explore that particular dynamic, and how did that manifest on page?
No problem. Well, so they're actually cousins, but they
Right.
look very much alike. So people often confuse them for each other or sisters. So that's, very common. Um, Manifesting on page, so that character who is the survivor, Audrey, is, when I was developing her character, I was thinking about myself at that age, and I was just, and still am to a degree, a terrible people pleaser, not really having good boundaries and then just not knowing how to establish myself or what I wanted. And like that was what was interesting to me as Audrey as a character is she is not the cool teen who knows everything or sassy or like I'm ambitious. She's still just trying to figure out who she is. So, in order to kind of mess with her, I'm like, well, that's the worst thing she would have to deal with is just a possession by a pushy ghost when she's a people pleaser with no boundaries. And, she feels really sad and guilty about her cousin's death. It's a mystery who killed her. And then all of a sudden, her cousin, who they haven't really ever gotten along, is in her body and trying to take over her whole entire life. Meaning, we have this murder to solve, but also Audrey has to figure out how to set up her own boundaries to deal with this possession because she's not quite ready to like just push her cousin out, but at the same time, she wants her own life.
Well, I think there's a really good, very obvious analogy there where you have real world family dynamics where somebody who's struggling to be their own person with a domineering, potentially narcissistic family member who is overpowering their own sense of self.
Mhm.
Now it's of course heightened because they're physically in her body. But it's something I think a lot of people can relate to. And I think it's something that horror does really well, where it amplifies a real world situation in perhaps a supernatural way, but gives you a chance to explore it. What was your experience when you were writing this particular dynamic in how you were pulling either from real world styles or making sure that it came through in a really authentic way?
Mm. It made me, a lot of times it's just as simple as thinking, how would I feel in this situation? And then the struggles of it is being, Audrey's an empathetic person who truly cares, which kind of makes, you a potential victim for narcissists or other people who might not have good intentions towards you, or people who don't even realize that their intentions are not that good or how they affect you. So the real world is just kind of the basic dynamic that can happen between those sort of opposing personalities. So with Audrey, a big reason that she even allows this ghost in the first place is she's not quite aware of it, but she has so much guilt over it, especially when it's apparent what's happening, and then she doesn't want to deal with this. But if she gets rid of her cousin, she's learning what happens to ghosts who don't have someone to host them, and she doesn't want to do that to her. And so she's has to either deal with living half a life basically, or damning her cousin to this eternity of being like a flickering residue of a person. So you know, it's not exactly real world, but anyone knows where when you're drawing boundaries, there's that thing where you worry about, well, if I do this, it's going to hurt this person XYZ. And I think with Audrey is kind of learning, what she can control, what she should try to control versus what, is not really her struggle.
I mean, I think it's a huge thing that people struggle with. Like, also knowing when to take responsibility and knowing when to say, that's not my fault. That's not my um, mission to fix. Like, unfortunately, Mara's passed away. That's not Audrey's responsibility to manage. In a real world situation, somebody makes a decision, that's not the other person's responsibility to completely say, okay, I'm going to shield you forever from either the consequences of your actions or from whatever was going on in your life. There is a boundary that needs to be set up where it's like, this person is this person, I am my own person. Because I think exploring the depth of that is really a riveting like topic, and it's something I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, it's something I've definitely struggled with in my own life, and that's easy to draw on, especially it's funny to think about that as like someone's personal horror, but like, oh, I have to set boundaries and it's even like high stakes. It's more than just saying, oh, no, you can't come over right now. It's no, you can't live inside me and dictate my life. But
I think for many people, though, especially who are on the more introverted, empathetic spectrum, that is a present day horror that they deal with every single day. And so it's for that particular group of people, I think this type of horror will
mm,
strike them right to their core.
yeah. it's you can some people say write what you know. I say write what scares you, and that scares me.
Well, that's an interesting topic. So, like, from my personal experience when I've read horror books, I've always been able to differentiate and say, this is fiction, this isn't real. And so, like, when I'm reading horror books, I tend not to feel very scared. I have a different reaction when I'm watching a horror movie because there's so much more input happening, and the jump scares get me. I hate them. I hate the jump scares. But when I'm reading the book, there's a bit of safety where I can go, okay, I'm good. This is on the page. I can separate myself from it. Um, but I also know that the things that I'm reading tend not to be things that necessarily scare me directly. Like they're not my worst fears. Um, People read horror for all sorts of reasons. Some people read it because they like the thrill. Some people read it because they want to be scared. When you are writing a horror book, or when you would advise somebody, if you would, on how they might write a horror book, what type of emotions, like, do you think the author should try specifically to scare the audience, or should they be trying to invigorate a specific type of emotion or reaction? What do you think the relationship, like, what is the author trying to convey with horror for their audience?
That's a really good question. So I don't think I set out to scare anyone, maybe myself a little, but you know, for me, like horror, the reason I like horror, like, and people with anxiety understand it's like I like to kind of catastrophize but in a safe way because if I have this outlet of horror and writing something frightening and like thinking of the worst case scenarios and how it could get worse, but it's fiction, it feels very safe because I have anxiety. So a lot of times I think, oh, I messed up on a project from work, and then I catastrophize to I will be homeless on the street because I messed up an email or something. That's so I like to channel that energy into something like books. So when I write it for readers, it's not necessarily that I'm trying to like scare them, but I'm almost trying to like share my own anxiety, like putting that on the page for people, like, and because I think I want to. I'm trying to think what is my intention when I write something scary. But I think it's more of this sharing like a powerful emotion and some people get that from romance and for me it's more of like a fear or anxiety, dread, that's where it gets my heart pounding. So that's what I'm trying to share with the reader.
Do you think that, like romance, there has to be a specific type of ending? Like in romance books, there should be a happily ever after. For horror books, do you think the main character, whomever, should survive? Or what type of ending should be the ending for a horror book?
Mm. So personally, my, you know, I think a very common style of ending in a horror book is that almost ambiguous or everything's fine now, but then you catch a glimpse of like a hand or something coming out of the dark. That just that hint of it's fine for now, but we'll see what happens. So it's almost a little bit ambiguous. And I do like that about horror. I don't think it's as, you know, with the romance, the happily ever after is a pretty standard. People get very up in arms and will actually say something's not romance if it doesn't have that happily ever after. With horror, to my knowledge, I don't think there's that kind of discourse. But I think my favorite horror books do have like a little hint of everything is fine for now, or they have that just more ambiguous ending.
When you're creating those ambiguous endings, um, is it more of the everything's fine for now for the character, or everything's fine for now for the setting, for the world, for the creature, whatever the supernatural thing is? How would you what would you lean into when you're trying to build up that ambiguity?
You know, well, for this particular book, it's more everything's fine for the characters, but the setting is still that, it still has that dark past and history. So who knows if what happened, it could repeat itself. History repeats itself. So that's sort of so for this project, it's the ambiguousness is what happens with Copper City after.
Books, stories, narratives, movies, things of that nature that have dealt with things that are supernatural have existed for generations. What do you think inspires people to write stories about supernatural things?
Mm. I think we're inspired to write supernatural stories based on curiosity and wanting to know the answers to things that we can't possibly know. So we kind of have to invent them, or, this is how we're going to, you know, hmm, understand things. Like I once read that the changeling trope with fairies switching out children might actually be related to, childhood diseases or different things that come up where it's like one day your baby is fine and the next day it seems like a different baby. And then that's how these stories came about to explain these other, like, these neurological things that were happening, because without, doctors and science and studies, it was like a supernatural occurrence. So they invented fairies or swapping out your baby. That's why it seems different all of a sudden. um, you know so I think with supernatural, it's just our way of trying to understand the world around us, or, in a more fun way, just trying to make it more interesting.
Well, for all the ways that people try to explain what's happening, do you think there's ever a moment where no matter how much we've explained, there's always going to be uncertainty? Or can you get, we know everything, there's no uncertainty, there's no possible room for something weird to be happening now?
Yeah. No, I think we'll always have uncertainty. Like, even when we think we have something figured out, you never know when there's going to be a new discovery, or just, a shift in the way the pole shift or something, that we're like, what is that? And how did, throughout human history, there's been so many mysteries and we've only solved a tiny fraction of them. So I think there will always be that questioning.
In your particular story, you use ghosts as a supernatural entity that's being discussed. We mentioned earlier there's a lot of different renditions or types of ghosts. Was there any particular story or religion or faith or previously created imagining of a ghost that inspired your particular version of ghosts?
For my particular, when I was a kid, I was the one at the library always just trying to find like books about creepy stuff. So I think that definitely played into it. Um, it's funny, I was raised very religious, but we didn't talk about ghosts. So so I think maybe that added to my fascination about it, is the absence of discussion on it. But one of the thing in more recent, pop culture was The Haunting of Hill House. I and I don't want to give spoilers. I know that show's been out for a few years now, but the broke neck lady ghost really had me thinking about, you know, ghost motivation. And because they seem so scary, but like maybe they're not really scary. Maybe they're just dealing with their own things. And the reason they appear is they're trying to share their story or get help. And that kind of like really had me thinking about what the purpose of my ghosts, because I didn't want them there just to be like scary things. It's like, yes, they are scary because, that's the nature of things we don't understand. They it's often frightening. But then it's like, why are they there and what do they actually want? Do they want to harm you, or are they wanting, is it a cry for help? So that, kind of really inspired me.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, your book is multi point of view, correct?
That is correct. I have two main point of view characters, Audrey and Zadie, and then I have a kind of snippets put in of another character, Shirley. That's also a POV character, but that's like a 10% of the book. So, the two main ones, though.
So when you're writing this particular story, how do you juggle the point of view characters just from a practical perspective?
So that was, when writing it, it was tricky because I kind of started with, I hadn't done a multiple point of view character story like before. So it was just kind of going in blind, but I really wanted to tell different aspects of the stories from the different characters because I found them equally compelling. But keeping them distinct even though they have very distinct personalities, sometimes when writing, I would write a really lovely description, but then I would read over it and like, well, this isn't Zadie's point of view, and that's not how her filter of the world is, and she's more brass, and you know, that's just not how she sees it. That's an Audrey description, so I can't use that for Zadie, even though I like it, because that's not how Zadie would describe something. Audrey's much more dreamy, and she's more prone to, waxing poetic, but Zadie is, she's more active and she's a little bit more, I want to get out and do things, and where Audrey wants to mull it over. So that became when I was writing Zadie chapters, Zadie had a lot more action because she is a think second person, whereas Audrey is, I'm going to dissect everything before I make a move. So that kind of helped thinking about how they process information and just what their goals are in their relationship to even the town. So Zadie, her goal from the beginning of the book is she wants to get out of Copper City. She doesn't want to be in this small, weird, Wild West town anymore. She wants to go to LA and have a music career. And then, so that's how she views the town is much different than Audrey, who loves the town and she wants to open up her own bakery and she wants to stay and be a part of this town forever. So they just how they view things is, you know, their descriptions, it's very different.
Do you have any advice for how you would, or let me restart that. Do you have any advice for new writers who are juggling multiple point of views on how they could potentially handle writing in that multiple perspectives?
I find it helpful to have like different music to listen to for the different characters. I can't listen to things with lyrics when I write, but I would have, with Audrey, I would listen to more, cinematic like soundtracks. And Zadie, it was like moody cello. And that's sort of how it would get my mind. This is that character. So if I start slipping into, the middle of them, I would hear the music and remember, no, this, I'm writing Zadie or I'm writing Audrey right now. So I found that helpful. A lot of it comes though in revision and just really dissecting how they say things. I tried to give them like slightly different speech patterns. Like they grew up in the same area, so it's not like they're gonna have different accents or anything like that. But one character is more brash and more opinionated and outspoken, so her inner thoughts are like that. The other, you know, her cousin's nickname for her was angsty, so she has a lot more like angst in her, and like just going through when I would revise, I would really think about are their personalities coming through in these sections.
Well, the other challenge that you had with this, particularly with Audrey, is that she's possessed.
Yeah.
Um, so when you're handling both the interiority of Audrey, but you also have Mara lurking in the wings, how do you juggle those two characters at the same time?
Mm. So that was, that those were some tricky ones to write, but I had a lot of fun with them. So with the possession, there are times it's like they kind of form a truce. Like you can't take over my body without discussing it. And and I had some fun scenes where just sitting like in the bathroom talking to herself in the mirror, but talking to her cousin, and just using like having those conversations, but also the inner conversations. And that was also a little horror fear of mine is having someone inside you who could read your thoughts. So not only is Audrey having to deal with this horrible situation, and she doesn't want to be there, her cousin's hearing her thoughts about her. And, Audrey does not like conflict. So it's her cousin doesn't mind, like, hey, I heard what you just thought about me. And so you have a lot of like inner turmoil. So writing that, there's a lot of rewrites and just trying to get it right and not have it be too confusing. Even just thinking about how I was formatting it, you know, came into play. Should I have it in quotations or italics? Just those nitty gritty.
Specifically for formatting, what was the formatting style you eventually settled on when dealing with things like that?
Mm. So when I would have them talking just in her head, I would have Mara's. input in italics. But when I would have them having conversations in a mirror, then it would be in regular quotations because she would be using her actual vocal cords. So that was became like how I would differentiate. And as the story moves on, the possession also grows. So it starts as more of like a whisper in her head, but by the end, it's like there's full conversations between people, even though there's only one body there.
The other element that your story has is that there's also this almost suspense mystery aspect of the murderer's on the loose. What do we do with the murderer? So you've got, the ghost story with Mara, which already is an amazing, distraction of like, this is something major happening, besides the fact that Mara died. But
Mhm.
now, why did she die? How did she die? What is happening? Who's the next girl? Um, when you're managing a very multi-layered plot, how do you go about balancing all of the different stressors, inputs, things that are happening to these characters?
Um, so that with having the that was where the having multi-point of view came in handy because Audrey was more dealing with, the possession, whereas Zadie's point of view chapters is Zadie's trying to solve the murder. And she's also, she's not really considering the supernatural aspects at first of this, what's going on. So she's really focused on trying to figure out what happened to Mara, who is her girlfriend. And throughout that, we have so through Zadie's story, it's the solving of the murder. Audrey's story is the solving of her possession, and then they kind of interweave and come together. Um, and I think I may have lost the thread of your original question.
No, it really is like that was the question of like how do you balance managing both the supernatural and the mystery at the same time? And in what I'm understanding is that you use the multi-person point of view in order to help balance that story.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, so that is how we did it because I think it would be because ultimately in the end they are all all three girls, even the spirit, are going towards the same thing, but they are all going through it from different ways. And so it was fun to start at those three different paths and have them interweave and then finally join together.
What do you think's a good balance of the amount of time you spend with one character versus the amount of time you spend with another character?
Mhm. So I think that varies from story to story. When I was writing this one, I read a lot of multi point of view stories, and I found most had one character that would have not necessarily significantly more, but a little bit more to be almost like the main character. And then next there would be a lot that were almost 50-50, but for the most part, there would be one that was a little bit more, and generally that's the one who starts the story and ends the story. Um, Mine, I'd say it's about 60-40, because I did find both characters equally compelling to write. But ultimately, with Audrey having to deal with the possession and stuff, she kind of gets the beginning and end.
Is there a voice that you particularly liked more than the other?
I think Audrey was easier to write because she's more similar to myself. But I think Zadie was more fun to write because Zadie's like the girl I wished I could have been like when I was, 18. So so that added like, you know, that's the cool thing about being a writer is you get to experience these other lives. Um,
When did you first start writing the story?
hmm, that is a good question. So it actually probably about 5 years ago. So it's been a long one in the making, but it's been through a few different like iterations. And I've been through two agents since it. So, different drafts and stuff. But yeah, about 5 years, which the first draft was very different than what it ultimately ended up being. But I've it's actually I've written stuff where I've done major rewrites and I'm like, oh no, this isn't working. But this one, every rewrite, I'm like, oh no, this is getting closer to what it was should be.
If I could ask, what was one of the major differences between your first draft and then this draft that you write now?
Well, so the first draft didn't have the third POV character, Shirley. It had hints at the lore and the history of the town and what was going on, but it didn't have um, the the really strong, important thread to tying the town to what was happening supernaturally wise, and that's where the Shirley character, she was in the first book, but she was minor and just kind of in the background. It's hard not to give, I don't want to give away spoilers, but so when I rewrote it and added that, that was the thread that really wove the two girls' stories together along with the town and the big supernatural undercurrent, and just kind of explains the lore, but in a way that it added a whole nother storyline to the book, which made the book very long. And then I had to do, cut about 20,000 words, but you know, I learned a lot along the way.
Um, the word count cutting is definitely something that comes up time and again during these interviews. And I do like asking, how did you specifically go about cutting out 20,000 words?
Um, so first, you hope that you have the word just in there 20,000 times, which is not the case. But, you start off looking for those filler words, which, you know, was good. And I did get some, but there were a lot of scenes that I wrote because it was fun and that they didn't actually have anything to do with the unity of the story and tying the plot through line together. They were more like, oh, this is a cool thing these characters would do, and it's more like the pieces you write for yourself and that you have to kind of step back to see what is this scene contributing to the rest of the book, and is there, if it's contributing one line or one detail, can we move that somewhere else and make that a different scene stronger to have that detail instead of having a whole scene for this one little beat. So I did have to get rid of things that I loved, but ultimately, you know I start someone phrased it to me as the unity of the story. You want to make sure that every scene unifies the story further. So if you have like this little, side scene where it's like, oh, it's a cool day at the fair or whatever, and it's like an awesome scene, but it doesn't actually move the plot forward, there's not a purpose for that scene to be there other than you like it. So I had to kind of look at scenes like that and be like, okay, that doesn't need to be here, even though I really like it, but it doesn't move the story forward. So when I made those kind of cuts, it got easier. There was a couple like little like B and C storylines that got removed, which was difficult because then you had to go comb through the story and check for ripples, So if you pull out a thread, it snags along the way in other chapters, and you're like, oh, well, they wouldn't be thinking that now here because this hasn't happened anymore. So, it was cumbersome, and it also really made me think about writing in the future, like how I'll outline and be more like deliberate and clear instead of, because I'm kind of a discovery writer. So I do end up like going off course quite a bit and then having to bring myself back and figure out. So now I make much more rigorous outlines. I do still explore, but I don't let myself get too far off track.
When you're writing your outlines, what are things that you specifically keep in mind when you're either just starting the outline or even throughout the process? Do they evolve as you work, or have you had new iterations of new ways of making your outlines? What works best for you?
I usually try to get the big kind of tentpole moments, like the beginning, middle, and end, and how we get to those parts. But and then after I have like here are the beats, I do love, a good save the cat beat sheet, just to, give you an idea of where to put different scenes. Um, but then I like to go in and get like and look at this happens, therefore, or because this other thing happened, not this happens, because when it's that and, it usually doesn't have that unity. It's not tied as strongly together. So it's like if it's like hearing little kids tell a story, like and we went to recess and there's a dog and there's a, so you want it to be this happens, therefore. So everything is like dominoes knocking it down. So that's what I really look for in my outlines to make sure that it's everything seems progresses in a way that's intentional and would happen because of what preceded before it.
When you're balancing two different point of view characters that are doing different things in different places at the same time, how do you interweave those chapters together, where somebody's doing something over here, but then the next chapter, someone else is doing something over
Mhm.
here?
Yeah, that was tricky. I did use like I had two separate rows of index cards, kind of plotting out where they'd be at the same time, and just thinking, I kind of switched it more of who's having the more action, like what's going on with this person at this time. And there were a few scenes I rewrote from the other character's perspective because I would originally think, well, no, this seems like something Zadie would see from her, because they also had a lot of scenes together. Um, so, which is helpful when they're together because we know what's happening on the page for both characters. When they're apart, it's a little bit more difficult. I kept the time going so I wouldn't tell things, you wouldn't have one chapter and then the following chapter be the same timeline. It would be what would happen after. So that was helpful, but it was a lot of like, I had to rewrite things or go back and look at, does the time make sense on this? I had to get very like granular with this is at this time, this is this day, because it was easy to like realize, oh, it should be night now, or it's been Wednesday for 4 days, that kind of thing.
While you were working on this, I mean, you said that it took 5 years to write the story. Was it because there were a lot of life things? And I know you're working a full-time job on top of everything else. How did you juggle writing the book while also managing all of the other responsibilities going on in your life?
Well, it's funny because there was another book in between all that that's that I tried. So I pick things up and put them down. But managing life, because I work full time, I'm a mom. My partner has disability so it's not always able for us to do 50-50. So sometimes more housework and stuff falls on me. So it's really, I have to kind of like stake my claim in time to get writing done. I the first thing I did when I was getting really serious about trying to get a book out there was I cleared out a walk-in closet and shoved a desk in there so I could have my own space where I could close a door and like be away from my family, which I love them, but it's very hard when you're a mom or, people want to like, oh, look at this TikTok or whatever. Like, so if you have a door that can close in a room that's too small for anyone else to be in, it's very helpful to get where it's done. And then I just had to be really, I had to claim my time and make sure, even when it was, I get up like at 5 a.m. to get that hour of writing in before everyone else is up. So I have my time where I know I'm not going to be interrupted. And my family has gotten much better about respecting my time, especially like on weekends. I'll take a few hours. So having a place where you can shut a door and a time that's just yours is very helpful. And also, I'm not someone to say you must write every day to be a writer, but I do believe kind of touching your project daily, even if it's just like opening like your laptop or looking at it or thinking, keeps you engaged with it and helps you finish and not feel like, if you take a week off, you feel lost when you go back to it. So that's a big thing for me is my goal. It sounds small, but it ends up building is I always try to write 30 minutes a day. And sometimes that writing 30 minutes a day is just kind of rereading what I wrote the day before, but it's touching the project. So it helps me just stay on top of it and make visible progress, which is, keeps me going.
Before we leave today, I just wanted to ask you if there's anything that we haven't had a chance to talk about that you would like to talk about.
Mm, No, I'm just really grateful for you having me on. The writing is a very lonely pursuit. Like you're often by yourself, in my case, in a closet, like and inventing things. So like meeting other writers and like just so I guess what I would recommend to people is make communities. We met on Discord, yay. But and just if you can have a writing group, I think that's just having people who are cheering you on and want like have similar goals is just a beautiful thing that will keep you going as a writer.
Are there any writing groups that you can specifically recommend, or is there any way to find a writing group that you might recommend?
Well, I'm a member of the Bi Plus Book Gang. So we meet on Discord, and then we have accountability sessions where you can zoom in and everyone just writes or works on whatever project, just to have that sense of where you're not alone. That one, I think I reached out to Bailey who started it like on TikTok because she was just like talking about it. And but I know plenty of people who have started their own writing groups. I have a friend in town that we've been writing together for, I'm gonna age myself, 13 years now. And like we met on Craigslist. I put out an ad, like, anyone wanna, so we met on the internet. But like sometimes it's just like me reaching out to local groups and people, and a lot of people are secret writers and you never know who it is, and it's really nice to meet someone.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
That's it for this week's episode of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. LL Madrid's book, My Lips, Her Voice, is out on the 14th of October, 2025. Follow the links in the description to find out more. If you enjoyed this content, please do like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to make you more. Bye for now.